In this video, we will be looking at some of the lesser-known hidden history of JFK and how he and the Kennedy family relate to the Ritchie Boys of World War II, who were a division of psychological warfare officers during the war. Most of the information in this video comes from a new book, The Quiet Contingent, which details the lives of over 450 Ritchie Boys. So let's dive in, starting with journalists. During the war, Ritchie Boy Herman Lang worked as an interpreter on General George S. Patton's staff. Lang was later promoted to the rank of captain, and at one point was in charge of a prisoner of war camp that contained 40,000 SS troops. After the war, he worked as an interpreter for the Nuremberg trials. When Lang returned to the USA, he took a course in cameras and applied for a job at CBS and was hired by them in 1951. He was assigned to Edward R. Murrow's Person-to-Person, covered presidential inaugurations, the space program, and Jacqueline Kennedy's White House tour feature. Ritchie Boy Don Mankiewicz worked on the 1964 to 65 NBC series called Profiles in Courage, which was adapted from President John F. Kennedy's book of the same name. Don had a brother, Frank, who was involved with the Kennedys, serving as the campaign press secretary for Senator Robert F. Kennedy, and was also present at his assassination. Following the murder, he was in charge of press bulletins and announced RFK's death. Ritchie Boy Edward Katurba had served in the war as a Russian and Czech interpreter. After the war, he went into journalism and penned popular columns such as A Bit of Washington and Jottings from Washington, which were initially local news but ended up in national syndication. Katurba's first major piece for the paper was a 6-part investigative piece on election fraud and slot machine scandals where children were allowed to gamble in southern Maryland. This reporting eventually led to 2 grand jury investigations. Upon Katurba's death, President John F. Kennedy began his morning press briefing on the 28th of June 1961 with comments on Katurba's passing, stating, He was an outstanding newspaperman who was associated with Scripps Howard, and we want to express our sympathy to members of his family and also to the papers with which he was associated. I want to say personally that I'm extremely sorry to have heard the news. Another journalist who was no stranger to the lives of the Kennedys was Ritchie Boy Ted Knapp. Whilst covering Robert Kennedy, Knapp was known to his press secretary, Wesley Barthelmess, who recalled of Knapp's reporting in an interview, quote, The other one who was very difficult was Ted Knapp of the New York World Telegram, and he was the only reporter that in my experience the senator complained against. His reporting was absolutely atrocious. He wrote a water pollution story once that got Vietnam in the lead as well, and it was just a very bad job. It was a difficulty with the New York Times that existed primarily because of the editorial board chairman, John Oakes. End quote. Barthelmess was, of course, talking about Ritchie Boy John Oakes, who had trained other Ritchie Boys in the ways of black propaganda as an instructor at Camp Ritchie. During the Watergate scandal, Knapp was president of the White House Correspondents Association and was also known to have been someone who pestered President Richard Nixon, so much so that he found himself on Nixon's enemies list, much to his dismay. Another person who found themselves on the enemies list of Nixon was Ritchie Boy Hans F. Loser. During wartime, Loser had participated in battles at Nijmegen and the Battle of the Bulge. In the immediate wake of the war, he stayed in post-war Germany as chief of section in the U.S. military government for Bavaria, where he was heavily involved in denazification programs. Following university, he joined the law firm of Foley, Hoag, and Elliott in 1950, which at the time was a small firm of about 10 lawyers, and today employs around 250. In the 1960s, he responded to a call by President John F. Kennedy asking for more law firms to be involved in the civil rights movement, the result of which led Loser to found and chair the Lawyers' Committee for Civil Rights in 1963 under the Boston Bar Association. The Lawyers' Committee has been responsible for significant amendments to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It also had a big hand in enacting Lyndon B. Johnson's Order 11246, which prohibits federal contractors and federally assisted construction contractors and subcontractors who do over $10,000 in government business in 1 year from discriminating in employment decisions on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, and requires employers to take affirmative action to ensure that applicants are employed and that employees are treated during employment without regard to their race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. The Lawyers' Committee for Civil Rights has also been behind many high-profile cases in recent years, such as Taylor Dumpson versus Brian Andrew Ade et al., whereby an African-American woman sued Andrew Anglin of the Daily Stormer for hate crimes and internet trolling to the tune of over $700,000. The city of San Jose versus Ross, which was in dispute of a citizenship question being added to the 2020 census, and they were victorious, where according to the Brennan Center quote, on July 11, 2019, the federal government announced that it would abandon its pursuit of the citizenship question. The judge in this case subsequently issued an injunction permanently preventing the Commerce Department from adding a citizenship question to the 2020 census. End quote. Another case, Georgia Coalition for the People's Agenda versus Raffensperger, argued against voter registration law requiring data to exactly match that of their government identity, citing that it negatively impacted Black, Latino, and Asian voters. Moving on, Ritchie boy Igor Cassini was born Count Igor Cassini-Loyevsky. He came from an aristocratic family in Russia. His grandfather, Arthur Paul Nicholas Cassini, had served as the Russian ambassador to the United States during the administrations of William McKinley and Theodore Roosevelt. Following the Bolshevik Revolution, the family lost everything and chose to leave, eventually moving to the USA in 1936. In America, Cassini soon made his name as a newspaperman and then joined the U.S. Army where he was stationed at Camp Ritchie. His bunkmate at the camp was Max Horlick, who would later work for the CIA and later the Office of Intelligence Research at the U.S. State Department. After the war, Cassini was partially instrumental in the founding of the public relations firm Marshall & Company, which boasted clients such as Fiat, Lanvin, and Roy Chalk Transit. Cassini was a good friend of the Dominican diplomat Porfirio Rubirosa and allegedly expressed interest in taking on the Dominican government as a client for Marshall & Company. This incident turned out to become a major scandal. Journalist Peter Moss, best known as the biographer of Frank Serpico, was one of the key figures who spearheaded charges against Cassini and his Dominican ties in the press. Moss had written a piece in the Saturday Evening Post alleging that Cassini was not only on the payroll of Rafael Trujillo, but that he was also informing the White House about a potential communist plot to overthrow the Trujillo government. This was on the basis of Cassini having informed JFK's father, Joseph P. Kennedy, and then director of the CIA, Allen Dulles, that there were rumors of a Castro-inspired coup in the country. Cassini was then accompanied by the American diplomat Robert Daniel Murphy to the Dominican Republic to investigate the situation there. Murphy went on to speak about the meeting, saying, quote, Mr. Cassini provided a helpful and convincing account of President Kennedy's handling of this important problem, especially the feature of open conferences and the acceptance of the fact that there would be inevitably critical and even hostile elements attending. Trujillo authorized Mr. Cassini to work out a plan of improved communications, including the selection of a professional public relations expert from the U.S. to work in the DR for a better public image of the DR abroad. End quote. Shortly after, on the 2nd of May 1961, McGeorge Bundy, who at the time was the president's special assistant for national security affairs, presented Murphy's report to President John F. Kennedy and noted, quote, I know nothing of the Dominican Republic except by hearsay, but I think there can be little doubt that the whole concept of the Alliance for Progress would be gravely shadowed in the eyes of Latin Americans if we were to move to anything like a policy of friendly guidance toward Trujillo. At the risk of misunderstanding, I think I ought to add that if the public were to know that Igor Cassini is providing public relations help to Trujillo, your own personal position as a liberal leader might be compromised. End quote. The Alliance for Progress had been launched earlier that year by Kennedy and would be staffed and influenced by Ritchie Boys David Rockefeller, Walter J. Sedwitz, Anthony Geber, and George W. Landau, and Philip Glessner as director. We will return to the Alliance for Progress later in the video. The allegations of serving as a foreign agent led to Cassini being prosecuted for failing to register under the Foreign Agent Registration Act, also known as FARA, and he pled no contest. He was made to pay a $10,000 fine. It has been noted that the no contest plea was partially to protect his brother Oleg from further scrutiny, who at the time was in a very visible relationship to the Kennedy family. Oleg was best known as Jacqueline Kennedy's stylist. The so-called Jackie look was the brainchild of Oleg Cassini, although one particular look had a high cost to the feline community. After the debut of Jackie in a leopard skin coat, the trend took hold, leading to the deaths of 250,000 leopards, nearly driving the species to extinction. This led to Oleg choosing to use faux fur for his designs. He was later awarded the Humanitarian Award in 1999. This was at a fashion show and gala at the National Building Museum in Washington, D.C., with honorary chairpersons Eunice Kennedy Shriver and Senator Ted Kennedy. Igor Cassini's third wife, Charlene Stafford Reitzman, was the daughter of oil magnate Charles Beerer Reitzman, who owned a property in Palm Beach that JFK was known to frequent. Aside from getting style tips from Cassini's brother Oleg, Jackie also took style notes from the matriarch of the Reitzman family, Jane. The famous Palm Beach property was later sold by Jane Reitzman in 1985 to Les Wexner, before it was sold to Massachusetts nursing home magnate Abraham Gossman. Gossman renamed the property Maison de l'Amity, and after he filed for bankruptcy, the home was purchased by Donald Trump, who famously outbid Jeffrey Epstein in the process. The home was then sold to the Russian magnate Dmitry Rybolovlev, before being demolished and the lot being split into 3 different homes. When it came to Igor Cassini's charges, the Democratic politician James William Fulbright also remarked on the affair in an interview, quote, "There were 2 registered foreign agents that the committee concerned itself with that have particular relevance here. Or rather, there were 2 foreign agents, one registered and one not. The one who was not registered was Mr. Cassini, who, as you know, was subsequently indicted. I told the president about some aspects of it. I might, for the record, state that Mr. Cassini's wife, who was the daughter of the neighbor of President Kennedy's father's place, their places adjoined in Palm Beach, she was the daughter of a Mr. Reitzman who owned the place next to Mr. Kennedy. It was through this social connection, friendly connection, that Cassini came into the picture and was, of course, well known to the Kennedys. We believe that he would possibly seek to, embarrass the president and his family in the course of a trial. And I thought the president ought to be aware of what we knew about the case. And I told him what we knew about it. That was the extent of it." End quote. Moving on, Ritchie boy Herbert W. Klotz also had a relationship with the Kennedys. After his time in the war, Klotz had become an investment banker in New York and Washington. From 1962 to 65, he was Assistant Secretary of Commerce for the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. He had prior met Kennedy in 1939 after having donated money to Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. to aid in efforts after the SS Athenia tragedy. He was surprised that when he met JFK again in 1960, Kennedy remembered him, stating, quote, "Oh yes, I know Herb Klotz very well. I remember, as though it were yesterday, the donation he made for the survivors of the Athenia disaster." End quote. Until his formal government posting, Klotz had worked on the Kennedy-Johnson campaign as the Associate Director of the Businessmen's Committee. He explained in an interview that his task was less to do with fundraising, but assuring bigger financial powers of fiscal security should Kennedy win. He wrote letters to high officials in investment banks and heads of leading financial institutions in Germany, Switzerland, England, and France, counteracting the Republican Party's efforts to plant stories in the institutions that Kennedy would be bad for business. He remarked, "I recall that there had been a meeting of the International Monetary Fund here in Washington a month or 2 before the election, at which leading officials of the Eisenhower administration were spreading these stories among the heads of European central banks who were here for the meetings. Obviously, our purpose in convincing these foreign bankers of the senator's fiscal soundness was not to get votes. These were difficult enough to find among our own bankers, and you may think it was a waste of time to convince the bankers of Switzerland or Great Britain. However, our principal purpose in reaching them was to prevent a substantial decline, if not a crash, in the stock market and a flight of the dollar in our gold reserves from these shores in the event of Senator Kennedy's election, which became more likely and probable to us the closer we came to Election Day." End quote. Klotz was also involved with preparations for the New York World's Fair, which hosted monuments to Kennedy following his assassination. Klotz resigned from government service after details of his stock market activities came to public attention. When it came to social causes, Ritchie boy Richard Shifter, along with Arthur Lazarus, became the main attorney for the Oglala Sioux tribe of the Pine Ridge Reservation. In 1960, during the Kennedy campaign, Shifter told his friends who were involved with Kennedy to put public housing for American Indians, and made it policy as an adage to the Housing Act of 1938. He spent many years working in the interests of Native Americans and championed their cause many times in the courts. From 1966 to 67, he served on the President's Task Force on American Indians. Shifter was active in other social causes, like becoming a co-founder of JINSA. He was also instrumental in helping the family of Ritchie Boy Bill Hess with their restitution claims against Germany. The law firm he was working for at the time was in part led by Sergeant Shriver, who was the brother-in-law of JFK and helped him to establish the Peace Corps. Ritchie Boy Peter Weiss had previously run the International Development Placement Association, also known as the precursor to the Peace Corps. His wife, Cora Weiss, worked with Sergeant Shriver to establish what is now known as the Kennedy Airlifts. Cora was also instrumental in introducing Tom Mboya to John F. Kennedy whilst he was campaigning as part of his presidential run. Cora had previously worked with Frank C. Montero to secure funding for the foundation and managed to obtain support for their efforts from the likes of Sidney Poitier and Harry Belafonte. Tom Mboya managed to secure $100,000 for an airlift program, now known as the Kennedy Airlifts, which took nearly 800 East African, mostly Kenyan students, and placed them in American universities. Part of the initiative was to purportedly grow a new generation of nation builders in Africa. The money came directly from the Kennedy Family Foundation, which was managed by Sergeant Shriver. The African students were placed into predominantly white universities at the time, prior to the forced desegregation of schools. Cora remarked on the impact that the airlift program had by saying, "I maintain, and I haven't been disproven on this, that the African students were the wedge that opened the door to African Americans in Southern white colleges. I think that can be pretty well established." One of the students in the program was sent to the school owned by Ritchie Boy Hines E. Bondi, Windsor Mountain High. The school was known to be ultra-progressive at the time, and Bondi's parents had worked with the Freud family prior to the war. Several famous people sent their children to Windsor Mountain, including Sidney Poitier, Harry Belafonte, and Max Jacobson. Jacobson was also known by his moniker Dr. Feelgood for his administration of drugs to many prominent individuals, among them John F. Kennedy himself. Ritchie Boy Peter Weiss was known for his efforts and activism as a lawyer, and from 1963 became chairman of the Institute for Policy Studies, serving on the board of directors until the 1990s. The IPS was a little-known, yet highly influential left-wing think tank co-founded by the legal activist Marcus Raskin, who along with Ritchie Boy William Sloane Coffin Jr. had been a member of the Boston Five, who were arrested for their actions as part of a draft resistance program. William Sloane Coffin Jr. also worked with Cora Weiss as part of SANE, National Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy. Coffin Jr. had also been approached by Sergeant Shriver to become an advisor to the Peace Corps in 1961. Moving on, Ritchie Boy Robert Comer, also known by his nickname Blowtorch Bob, had attended Harvard, joined the CIA, and worked for the Office of National Estimates in the 1950s. In 1959, Comer was placed in a position to the Department of State to work on the Joint Disarmament Study Group. Following the election of John F. Kennedy, Comer's position on the National Security Council's planning board looked to be over when McGeorge Bundy declared that Kennedy had no plans to continue the NSC structure of his predecessor. A week prior to Kennedy's inauguration, Comer wrote a letter to Bundy criticizing the NSC system as it had currently been arranged, condemning it as too sterile and bureaucratic. He suggested that the system be replaced with a much smaller board headed by Bundy and staffed with secretaries from departments of Treasury, State, and Defense guiding matters of foreign policy. Bundy was appointed by Kennedy as the Special Assistant for National Security Affairs and recommended to the President Comer's suggestion. As a result, a new, smaller NSC staff was formed which would later come to be known as the Little State Department, which focused on foreign affairs with a direct line to Kennedy, who would be frequently briefed and guided by the decisions of the Council. This department was situated in an office across from the White House and was headed by Bundy, the economist and former OSS officer Walter Rostow, and Ritchie Boy Henry Kissinger. Comer served on the new NSC Council from 1961 to 63 with a focus on India and Yemen, with a specific focus on the North Yemeni Civil War, which would come to be known in the press as Comer's War. He would later play a role in the Vietnam War as one of the architects of the Phoenix program. Comer also worked with Ritchie Boys from the Foreign Service when it came to actions in the Middle East under the Kennedy administration. In an interview, Ritchie Boy Francois M. Dickman explained, quote, "So a small secret group was formed, chaired by NEA Deputy Assistant Secretary Jim Grant, who would later become the head of UNICEF. The group also included Bob Comer of the National Security Council, Bill Polk of Policy Planning, Near East Office Director Bob Strong, Reith Gathright from ACDA, Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, and myself as the gopher, note-taker, and record-keeper. I believe that my colleague Bill Crawford, who was the Israeli desk officer, was involved on the periphery. There were a number of meetings in Grant's office. I would give the small group a code name of CANE, which was an acronym for Control of Arms Near East. Since our meetings involved nuclear weapons policy and our interest in getting the Israelis to let our experts visit Dimona on a regular basis, I remember having to get a Q clearance." End quote. The group also employed Jack McCloy, who had previously been High Commissioner to Germany following World War II. As part of his work with the group, McCloy visited Egypt and Israel and met privately with President Nasser. Ritchie Boy Herman Altz aided McCloy in his confidential endeavors. At the time, McCloy was also working as a chairman for David Rockefeller's Chase Manhattan Bank. Ritchie Boy David Rockefeller was no stranger to the Kennedy family. Midway through his school year, JFK's father Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. accepted a position as the ambassador to the United Kingdom. Rockefeller attended many of the same social gatherings as the family and met John F. Kennedy for the first time at a party. Both men had attended Harvard but never met until their time in London. Kennedy Sr. would soon fall out of favor with British high society for his anti-war position, and his tenure as ambassador ended in 1940. In 1963, JFK allegedly requested the establishment of a business group in the USA to combat Fidel Castro's influence on Latin America. As a result, Rockefeller established the Business Group for Latin America, now known as the Council of the Americas, which also works in tandem with the Americas Society, which is now known as AS/COA. One of the Kennedys currently on the senior advisory board to AS/COA is Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, oldest sister of RFK Jr. Many prominent people have worked for both societies, one being Ritchie Boy George W. Landau. Landau was a former Foreign Service officer who was asked by David Rockefeller personally to work for the AS/COA. In an interview, Landau said, "But when David Rockefeller asked me once again in 1985 to come to AS/COA, I asked Secretary Schultz for his advice. He said it was up to me, but added, if David Rockefeller made me an offer like that, I'd take it. So I followed his advice and retired from the Foreign Service on June 30th, 1985, and on the very next day began my first term as President and Executive Officer of AS/COA. Working at AS/COA was really the Foreign Service on steroids. All of a sudden, you meet every Latin American president, foreign minister, finance minister, and central bank president. It was terrific. At the same time, Coca-Cola invited me to chair its Latin American Advisory Board, which met 3 times a year." He continued, "I also joined other corporate boards. It was very interesting and also lucrative. At AS/COA, I worked closely with state and the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative on free trade agreements, beginning with the U.S.-Canada Accord. I still know more about lumber in Ontario than anyone should. We lobbied very hard for the North American Free Trade Agreement, starting during George H.W. Bush's presidency. David Rockefeller and I played a big part in convincing President Bush that a free trade zone from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego was the way to go. Bush duly made the announcement at the Washington Conference of the Council of the Americas in 1990. End quote. Landau wasn't the only Ritchie boy who supported NAFTA. Senator John Chafee was also an advocate for it, along with Sidney Weintraub, who was known as the intellectual godfather of NAFTA. In July of 2020, President Trump replaced NAFTA with the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. Prior to that, Trump had also appointed George Landau's son Christopher to be the U.S. ambassador to Mexico. George Landau had also previously worked on the aforementioned Alliance for Progress, as did Ritchie boy Philip Glessner. After the war, Glessner had studied at Columbia University under Arthur F. Burns, who would later become chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank. Glessner himself also went on to work for the Federal Reserve Bank and was posted in Chile and Brazil. He then worked for the Inter-American Development Bank, serving as director for the Alliance for Progress during the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. The Alliance for Progress was an initiative launched by JFK in 1961, promising social reform, economic growth, increased literacy rates, and was also ostensibly to fight the threat of communism in Latin America. It was known as Latin America's Marshall Plan and offered $20 billion in aid to 22 countries. Part of the program was enabled by the Inter-American Development Bank, which some Ritchie Boys also worked for. The alliance was in operation until its suspension in 1969 and has since been seen by some economists as a failure. Ritchie Boy Walter J. Sedwitz had previously worked at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, acting as chief of the Foreign Research Division. He was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He acted as director of the Council's Latin American study. Sedwitz became the secretary of the alliance and worked closely with Carlos Sanz de Santa Maria. He also worked for the Inter-American Development Bank, which had been part founded by Ritchie Boys Arnold Weiss and Anthony Jeber, with Ritchie Boy Duncan A. D. McKay also worked as secretariat. Arnold Weiss was best known as one of the soldiers who tracked down Hitler's last will and testament. He also worked as a translator and interpreter for the Nuremberg trials. After the war, he worked at the U.S. Treasury as general counsel to the Office of International Finance, where he enforced international regulatory policies. These policies were used to promote coordination between the recently formed International Monetary Fund and World Bank. From there, he went on to co-found the Inter-American Development Bank. Another co-founder of the bank was Ritchie Boy Anthony Jeber, who had been a schoolmate of Kurt Waldheim, who would later go on to be the president of Austria. Jeber worked in Vienna when Waldheim was the foreign minister, and prior to his time there, he had been assigned to Latin America as part of the Alliance for Progress. His work at the Alliance for Progress was tied into his co-founding of the Inter-American Development Bank, as he had drafted the establishment for it whilst working at the Office of Economic Development and Finance in the Bureau of Economic Affairs in the late 1950s. When JFK was murdered, Ritchie Boy William A. Emerson Jr. reported on it. Emerson Jr. had been stationed in the China-Burma Theater and would later make a name for himself as a journalist. Whilst in Montgomery, Alabama, Emerson Jr. documented the rise of Martin Luther King Jr. and covered the bus boycotts. During his time at Newsweek, he covered many of the protests during the civil rights movement, including Ku Klux Klan meetings and the lawsuit Brown versus Board of Education, which Ritchie Boy David E. Feller drafted friend of the court briefs for. Emerson Jr. moved from Newsweek to the Saturday Evening Post, where he most notably reworked an upcoming issue in the immediate aftermath of the assassination of JFK. As part of this endeavor, he was able to include tributes from both Arthur Schlesinger Jr. and the former President Eisenhower. When it came to a memorial for Kennedy, Ritchie Boy and architect Philip Johnson designed the John Fitzgerald Kennedy Memorial in Dallas, Texas. He had also designed the Abby Aldrich Rockefeller Sculpture Garden for Ritchie Boy David Rockefeller and renovated Trump Tower. If you would like to know more about these Ritchie Boys and many others like them, please pick up a copy of The Quiet Contingent on Amazon or visit thequietcontingent.com. Thanks for watching.